Hello and welcome to the Museum of North Idaho's author interview with Jonathan Mueller, semi-retired landscape architect, and he's here to talk about his book, uh, Private Park, Public Park, about my favorite park. And you know what? I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to you, John, and you can tell us all about how City Park came to be.
Well, thank you, Jocelyn. I'm happy to be here. This is a neat way to kind of get the story out, and so I had been thinking a lot about the last 15, 20 years about the park, and having done some work in the park as a landscape architect, but it was just kind of you know, well, before we get started, what I'll do is I'll go through just, first of all, we'll talk about why I do a book like this, which I almost started to do there, and then just kind of give some overviews of the various chapters, and then get into a closing. And so what's neat about doing a book like this is you come across a whole host of other things that you don't expect. Picture on this page is of the Opera House, and that sat at the intersection of 4th and Coeur d'Alene. Eventually it burned by fire, but you start to put together the history of the city, and you come across these things. It's pretty amazing to see the stuff they had going on, cultural offerings they had as a community. But my background, I grew up in Coeur d'Alene, born and raised here. I went to school at Central School at 6th and Garden, and was first introduced to the park as a very young boy, and we would have a field day at City Park, and go down and play on the playground, have a picnic, and that was the end of the school year. And so it was always a place of wonder, and of course then later on growing up and getting to experience the beach in the summertime and Playland Pier, swim lessons, all of that, as a lot of us did. We had this really terrific relationship with this waterfront asset. And throughout the years growing up, junior high on 7th Street, this building no longer exists. And then eventually graduated Coeur d'Alene High School, going to University of Idaho, becoming a landscape architect, and then was introduced to this family, the landscape architects. I worked for the fellow on the left, Ted Worth. His father, Conrad Worth, in the middle, was a landscape architect, was kind of a contemporary of Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., but Conrad was the longest serving director of the National Park Service. And then his father, Theodore Worth, apprenticed with Frederick Law Olmsted Sr., became the parks director at Hartford, Connecticut, and then the longtime parks director at Minneapolis. And so when you work for a family like this, a tradition as a landscape architect of parks development, parks planning and design, you kind of begin to pick up some things about the how and why of parks, and you start to ask yourself some questions. Of course, Ted went on to have an international career and doing park work at all different levels, and so you kind of see that, and you say you put that in your frame of reference. And then more recently, as a leader in the American Society of Landscape Architects, you spend some time in Washington, D.C. advocating for certain types of legislation. You kind of understand that the federal government has a way of working. And so when you think about the story and the relinquishing of land that was in federal control to a local municipality, that story is very interesting and very compelling, because that doesn't always happen, not in this day and age. And so as a landscape architect, I look at that and from the scale of the projects I've done, and you put that into perspective, and suddenly you want to tell the story. And so, but in telling the story, Jocelyn, earlier you talked about, the fantastic growth, the why of it. We talk about the landscape setting and try to put that into context with a discussion about why people came here. And this is, a slightly photoshopped picture that Sean Gus did for the city of Coeur d'Alene. But if you look at it, and we were able to fly over the city where it was at the time, or wasn't, when Jon Mueller came through, this is what the landscape setting looked like.
I don't see a photograph. You might have to hit the green share screen.
Well, what, so we're not, so we're, the presentation hasn't,
Nope, I'm still looking at you.
are you? Well, I'm very
Yeah.
sorry. Well, let me just see what I can do here and come back. So where are we here? We'll go back here. There we go. That's what we want. Okay.
So there's a little on that menu bar. There you go. Yep.
Oh, okay. So now
Nice.
move that out of the way, and so uh, see if I can get that moved out of the way. There we go. And so then go back to presentation, and we're side by side, and so I can go back through the photographs very quickly. Of the Worth family and my experience growing up Coeur d'Alene, all those things. But we'll move forward now. Um, so we talk about landscape setting, and if when Mullen came through, and then eventually the U.S. military, Sherman, and did their kind of reconnaissance, and they made the choice that this spot, if you can see the cursor, that was where they were going to build a fort, and it was strategically placed. And but the landscape setting was really what I'm focusing on in that first chapter, and talking about landscapes of place and time and place, time and place, as kind of put forth by another very famous landscape architect, Grant Jones. And so the point of all this is that these landscapes reach out and touch us, but they have a reason that they're there. Obviously, our landscape formation story goes all the way back to a series of cataclysmic flood events that really shaped our landscape here in northern Idaho and eastern Washington. But essentially, 500 cubic miles of water was backed up into the Bitterroot Valley of western Montana, and that was released. The geologists say up to 70 or 80 times. And so those floods came through, washed out, carved out lakes, blew away mountain ranges, and created this landscape setting. And so, as we talk about formation, this is, I think, one of the first maps of the region that Mullen put together as he came through. And so I've always intrigued to see the old maps, what the first explorers did and what they charted and documented, and so this is obviously, you can see, if you can see the cursor, there's where the Coeur d'Alene mission is, and they originally came through and built the military road to the south, but it turns out that southern route came through some really flooded and hummocky country, and they decided to come back and rebuild the road going east. And this is obviously the documentation of that route and what they did. But we came to open up the country. We came in support of the transcontinental railroads, which were eventually to come, and that brought people. And so they came to this place landscape. And obviously, I think I related earlier, Jocelyn, about the comment from General Sherman. After Grant, they were trying to get him to run for president. And Sherman, thought he was way smarter than that. And, he was writing his wife, and he said, I'd rather have 2 tents on the banks of Lake Coeur d'Alene than live in the White House. And you can see why he came to this and saw this. And, he reminded him of the lakes in upstate New York. And so this became a place to come to. And so they built the fort. The fort occupied a large tract of land, almost 1,000 acres. And those boundaries became really critical in terms of what happened in the future with the park. And interestingly enough, as people began to come in support of a fort, because a fort needs food, it needs meat, it needs firewood, it needs a whole host of things to operate, the city began to develop at the eastern edge of the military reservation. And so the fort became kind of the source of all the cultural things. If you read those early versions of the Coeur d'Alene Press, they always talk about all these cultural events, band presentations, plays, masquerade balls that happened at the fort in the late 80s and into the 90s, and it was the place. And then they, you know, eventually began to play this game called baseball, 2 words. And of course, these pictures are of the fort grounds. This is roughly where the NIC campus is today, and the river's in behind here. And they set up and they played baseball. And as baseball grew in popularity, obviously they played the different teams around the region, and it was a big deal, you know. And so this reservation, the fort, was tightly or compactly developed near the mouth of the river, but the reservation went, you know, a good deal east to roughly 100 feet west of the right-of-way of First Street. If you can imagine that north-south street in Coeur d'Alene, it's roughly in that location is where the north-south boundary, easternmost north-south boundary of the reservation. And so it became known as, you know, Fort Sherman Park, this fabulous waterfront venue. And people, you know, as I've talked about the tight development of the fort, but people would come over once the Northern Pacific Line came to that 3rd Street location. They would come over for the day and for an outing at Fort Sherman Park, and I have a photograph of that later that I'll show you. But, you know, as we think about Idaho, the 2nd chapter talks about the formation of the state and, you know, the what and why and how of it. And, you know, Bob Singletary tells a great story of the vastness of the territory and how the formation of it, eventually it was broken up into 3 smaller states, but the vastness of it was more of a defensive exercise on the part of Lincoln, because during the Civil War, the Confederates were out everywhere looking for places to mine gold. And so a lot of the establishment of the Idaho Territory had to do with, as he tells it, making sure that this was a Northern Union territory and that the Confederates couldn't get their hands on, you know, the newly struck gold finds and silver finds in the region. And so we talk about the formation of Idaho, geographic monstrosity, and really we talk about it from the standpoint of what happened to the Panhandle and how, you know, once Montana finally decided to strike its current boundaries, the Panhandle was tossed around back and forth between Washington and Nevada and Idaho and a whole host of other kind of, you know, discussions and interest groups, and eventually landing, of course, as part of Idaho, but it wasn't without some challenges. And so obviously as part of this story, we have a congressional delegation that gets established and then gets elected. The guy on the left is Fred Du Bois. The guy on the right is Weldon Hayburn, who was a senator that came on in the 1900s. Fred Du Bois was one of our first senators. And then obviously below this gentleman here is Burton French, who was elected and then unelected and then reelected a number of times. But during the story of our park, these were the key congressional delegation players. And so, you know, we talk about the formation of Coeur d'Alene, we talk about the waterfront. You know, it's in a number of sources, the city is referenced as initially as a jumble of crude structures and tents. Coeur d'Alene Press, I think in the 1880s, claims that there were over 40 establishments in and around the fort where you could get a drink if you wanted one, which strikes me as being both astonishing and funny, but that was the Wild West, you know, and you stop and think about it. And so this is our waterfront, and you can see the railhead that was put in. This is roughly in the location of 3rd Street. And what's interesting, as the original Sherman Avenue, it only came to 2nd Street because the lake came all the way back to to the corner of Second and Sherman as we know it today. And everything south of that is fill that was placed as part of the industrial development of the city and as it progressed. Some of it was placed there as a result of the excavation for the later on around 1910, roughly either just before or just after, when the Milwaukee Road, built their rail line into, on the west side of First Street. But there was always something going on. And so you can see in this plot, there's Sherman Avenue, here's Second, and here's the lake, And so here's roughly where the resort sits today, and you can kind of get an idea of the amount of fill that was placed there. Again, just to kind of set the context for development. And so this city begins to develop. We see brick masonry buildings. We see a host of waterfront activities. We see a huge sawmill that was placed on what is now McEwen Park. And then we get about the business of being a municipality with fire and water and police and all those things. And this is our Main Street, And so all of this came about and was enhanced by, we talk about it in chapter 4, about the railroads and the transcontinental railroads and their impact on the opening of America and the importance of that. Fellow on the left is Frederick Weyerhaeuser, a very famous, obviously that's a well-known name in forest products industry. Guy on the right is Frederick Blackwell, not as well known as Weyerhaeuser, but in many ways a much larger player for what he did for our community and for places like Spirit Lake and then south of St. Mary's in the Fernwood, Santa, and Clarkey country for timber development. And so we become this railhead, this location for where timber and forest products converge. Because Lake Coeur d'Alene essentially is one gigantic mill pond. And so the transcontinental railroads come, and they come from a whole host of directions. This picture here is taken from St. Joe Baldy looking west to the Palouse, the south end of Lake Coeur d'Alene. But, the Rockefeller family built the Minneapolis and Chicago and St. Paul Railroad, otherwise known as the Milwaukee Road. And they came right down the St. Joe River, and it was one of the most expensive transcons to build. But again, eventually worked their way into Coeur d'Alene. But they came because this is how we opened up the West. But an interesting thing, they came through this federal country, and so the federal government gave them every other section of land. And so in this picture, you kind of get an idea. This is an aerial view of a part of North Idaho. And so the transcontinental railroads got this land. They turned around and sold it to the timber companies for a certain amount of money, which allowed them to build their railroads. The timber companies came in and logged it and manufactured forest products, and cities grew and the region prospered. And it was really an interesting system going forward. And it was all based on this legislation, federal legislation that we did in the 1860s and 1870s. So we have this discovery of vast stands of white pine and larch, which were very, very desirable in terms of making lumber for homes and for structures. These are on the left. These are photographs of the mill that was at Third and Front Street, Coeur d'Alene Lumber, and then the lower right hand picture is obviously of a sawmill that was on Blackwell Island. I think it was the Lewis Lumber, and then eventually became Blackwell Lumber. But again, we found these vast stands of timber, and we were we had a whole host of lumber producing concerns that descended on the area, and so as I talked about this waterfront just emerged, this urban and very industrial waterfront emerged in a very short period of time, 17 to 20 years. Whereas if you look at the evolution of the cities back east, what we did in 20 years, they did in 100 years. And so we just kind of slammed this down. But what I find so interesting about this picture, beyond the intensity of the waterfront development, is also you can kind of see the boundary of the original military reserve. And it's this line as we move forward, because that is roughly one lot depth away from First Street West, moving to the west. And it was a huge 1,000-acre tract. And so, and obviously we had these business concerns. Guy like my grandfather is this fellow. He came to Coeur d'Alene in 1910 and worked in the Coeur d'Alene mill, Coeur d'Alene Lumber Company mill, and that's how, you know, my family got here. Obviously, you can see Tubbs Hill. This is roughly, you know, where the K-27 Memorial is today, this location. But here's a photo that I think is really interesting to look at. This is one of the earliest photos we have of the waterfront of Lake Coeur d'Alene. And if you look, there's some very simple homes and some float houses, but a very rugged beach or coastline of the northern part of the lake. Some cottonwood trees, native cottonwoods, and then it sort of breaks into the ponderosa pine forest. But what's most interesting about this, beyond the configuration, is this fence right here. You see this white fence? I'm going to ask you to remember that, because that is the eastern boundary of the military reservation. When they came in and established these, they put in concrete monuments or stone monuments, and then they marked them off, demarked the boundaries, so people knew that this was military, it was federal land. You just didn't come in and do stuff without an okay. And as near as I can tell, this is in the early 1880s, this photograph. And of course, you can see the kind of the very, very natural state of the waterfront. And what's interesting is this, again, is the story of people came over on the Northern Pacific Line once it was punched in about 1885, 1886. And this comes as a photo, people on an outing at Fort Sherman Park on Lake Coeur d'Alene. They would come over to the edge of the lake, and they would ride the steamboats, and they would have an adventure. And so you can see this is very, very, you know, rugged, undeveloped, still in a fairly natural state. But as things progress, that changed. And here's a picture that I think is really amazing, because obviously as the city grew and developed, you can see the waterfront here. You can see Tubbs Hill in the background. You can see the beginnings of some of the downtown buildings. People are out on their bicycles for an outing. There's actually a kind of a waterfront path along here. But here is our white fence. So they're on the very southeast corner of the military reservation in this photograph. And so this became a natural place where city and fort kind of had common ground. It was the common place where they got together. And so as I look at these pictures, and I'll go back, especially this one, you know, this sits roughly where the Chamber of Commerce building is today, that spot right there. So that gives you an idea how much fill has been placed in the lake, but it also gives you an idea just of what a high level of change we had going through time. So we have a guy like Blackwell who then shows up and says, you know, he's a fellow from the East. He grew up and in the East, worked as a forest products industry person. His specialty was merging railroads with logging operations, you know, and I would have loved to have been there the day he got off the train and walked down to the waterfront of Coeur d'Alene. I always wondered what he thought he saw, because it was shortly thereafter he came in. He and his company bought huge tracts of stumpage, like 1 billion board feet, and he begins to acquire right of way for a railroad. And so he's going to do an electric railroad from Spokane to Coeur d'Alene, right to the waterfront, and he applies for an easement through the military reservation to come to the waterfront. And of course, this is after the fort has been abandoned and is ready to be sold at auction. And this map shows all the parcels roughly in the military reservation that were to be sold, he gets federal approval for his railroad right-of-way and a 20-acre tract to build depot grounds and a park, private park. So when people arrive, they have a nice place to get out. And so as the story goes, then the city of Coeur d'Alene got in the act. They wanted property for their own park. We have Forest Cemetery that was given as part of it, but the whole idea is that Blackwell and his holdings, they're going to bring their logs to or from this site, and depending upon what they're doing with them, and we'll bring tourists over during the day for fun. We'll take logs out at the night, during the night, and we'll make money coming and going. And it's kind of an interesting thing. And so they work with our congressional delegation to put this package together. The auction of the Fort parcels goes forward because the site had been abandoned, but the city got a cemetery site, which exists today, a beautiful cemetery. And the city got 20 acres for a park, which becomes merged with Blackwell's 20 acres and becomes this de facto 40-acre park on the lakefront of Coeur d'Alene. Now, Coeur d'Alene Press talks about, all the harumphing that the politicians did, and Weldon Hayburn's version of the legislation is one that was eventually passed. And he kind of says, I think they ought to name the park Hayburn Park. And the press kind of raised all kinds of cane over that and said, no, we don't think so. We think we ought to call it Blackwell Park because of what Blackwell has done for us. And besides, and it's just a little offhand comment, what I find is so interesting. It says if Hayburn had supported Fred Du Bois's version of the bill, we would have 80 acres instead of 20, and we would have far more parkland. And so if you stop and think about that for a minute, if this is 20 acres that the city got, and they were in line to get 80 acres, we would have had all of this waterfront as park. And so, which I find really astonishing, because if you think about that as an open space resource, it's pretty amazing. So anyways, Blackwell then proceeds to build his railroad. He builds his depot grounds. He also builds the city park, essentially the original version of it. And these, in chapter 5, we finally get to the park and we talk about it, but we talk a little bit about it within the context of what was happening in America. This particular picture here of this formal seating area, the rail line comes in, the depot is behind here. This roughly sits underneath the Coeur d'Alene North Towers today. This is a piece of land that no longer exists. So America in these days was kind of a smelly, dirty place. Industrialized, the world marveled at how we came forward through the Industrial Revolution and changed our cities. We had serious problems. I reference in a larger context this book by Richard Florida that talks about resets and what was going on in America at the time after the long depression of 1877. And there was kind of this industrial reset that was going on where we left the farm and came to the cities, and we transformed America. And so it brought a host of people forward who were trying to make our cities better. And these guys, and so the parks movement came forward to make cities less dirty, less smelly, but also to give people a chance to kind of get out and have something other than a smoke and industrialized living. And so the earliest versions of parks came forward in America, and this sort of was developed by these guys, Olmsted and Vox, Central Park. And so the theory of park and park planning came forward in a various assortment of phases. And so when you look at these different phases from 1850 through the present, the one I'm most interested in are these first two, which is the establishment of the pleasure ground, and they eventually kind of transformed to what was called the Reform Park, which had more intensely active things going on, like baseball and football and all these other things that had begun to emerge. And so this Galen Kranz, I think, talks about the evolution of parks in America. And so initially our park was developed as a pleasure ground. And, you know, we had our own industrial development. We had our own challenges with sanitation and human health and well-being. And so this was as much an action of city beautification as it was preservation and city building. And so Blackwell continues his entrepreneurship. You know, he and his partners build the Idaho Hotel, which was at the corner of First and Sherman. Some fill now being placed in a kind of a Spanish revival, you know, expression. That you know, building sat roughly right here, and so they're making their move. It's tourism, and they developed this park. So, what did our park look like? Well, essentially, we had the wagon road that came out of the fort and tied into the city. You know, we had these two 20-acre parcels, but they developed essentially, looks like about six to 7 acres on the city parcel, and they developed about 5 acres on Blackwell's parcel. And so they came in and they developed the depot. They had a series of car barns. This is roughly where the Chamber of Commerce sits today. And then they, you know, developed the park. And the park actually had some beginnings prior to when Blackwell got there, but the more refined version of the park didn't come until he got there. And so he had his battery building, which was a kind of a supplement to the electric railroad. He acquired the Thompson Pavilion and expanded it. We see, you know, the extents of the park graded and seeded, but the baseball function was maintained south of Mullen for quite a bit of time. And if you go back to that picture that's the cover of the book, that's a picture of a person standing like right here looking back towards this baseball field in the grandstand. And there was, actually at the time the photo was taken, there was a game being played. And so when I first saw that photo, I was really intrigued by it because, you know, I was never quite aware that baseball was played south of Mullen in the main part of the park, but actually it was, because it moved from, when the fort was closed and sold, it moved from the fort to this site. And they played, you know, this is where, you know, the city played its baseball games and they had fun. So we had this pleasure ground, but it was also kind of transitioning into this park that had active sports. They brought the cannon and the flagpole from the fort over and set it up. We had kind of a bathhouse along the waterfront. And so we had this really, you know, terrific park that was developed. And so, you know, how do we know all this? How do we place all this stuff? Well, one of the neat things I have at my command as a landscape architect is I have these digital databases. So we have the fort, and we have the city plat maps, and we have all this stuff laid out, and we can kind of merge it together, and you get an idea of sort of where everything was. And of course, this being the rail line coming to the waterfront, this is where the park is. This is where the depot grounds were. And so you merge all this stuff and you can begin to get a really good idea of how the park was built. Really, the only existing plan we have of the park is from a 1935 precinct map. And it shows pathways through the park. It shows the path house. It shows the pavilions. It shows the Memorial Athletic Field, which was built in the early 20s. And then it shows something called the tourist camp, which was very, very popular. And then it shows this little inset in 1909 when the county, or before that, when the county seat was moved over in 1909, Blackwell agrees to allow a donation of his portion of his 20 acres as a future courthouse site. And so we see kind of our city begin to develop. And then the other thing you see here is that we didn't have a Northwest Boulevard yet, but we did have kind of a connector to downtown. And this is our first view of what became Northwest Boulevard. And so again, you put all these maps together. I've got this map on the right is a map of the from the engineering plans of when they built the seawall in 1940. You see the pavilion, you see the auditorium they built. The pavilion is gone. The battery building is still here. But you merge all these databases together, and you can really get kind of an indication of what happened over time, where everything was. And that's how we sort of know, based on the pictures and the other things, what was in the park. And so it became this really terrific place for social gatherings, for athletic events. As early as 1912, they began to talk about moving baseball out of the park to the north side, just because there was so much pressure. This thing called the tourist park really took off. Initially, it was a place where people camped and who couldn't afford, a hotel room for the night. They would come over and camp and spend the night and then go home from wherever it was they came from. And so they camped a little bit on this west side, but eventually this area just now west of where the courthouse is today, where the county has, the justice facility and all its offices, was where the tourist camp was. When I was a kid, it was known as the Big Chief Campground. And so anyways, you start to see the evolution, formal floral display. And so this map, as shown in the book, really is pretty close. I would say, in hindsight, perhaps I didn't make the baseball field big enough, but you you merge all this stuff together, and this is the picture that kind of becomes fairly apparent as to what's going on. And so one of the interesting things that we did early on as a city was that the fort offered these dance events. And so you went down to the opera house at the fort, or the formal place where they had all their events in the fort grounds, and that became the social place to go. But as the fort began to kind of dwindle in its importance, and before it was actually moved to Spokane, the city kind of got this notion that they maybe should begin to think about having their own site, their own dance pavilion. And so they came down on the waterfront and they built this octagonal structure right here. And this is roughly where 3rd Street is. And this is roughly where Front Street is, as it turned and came over to 2nd. And so this structure actually sat pretty much right in the middle of what are now the Coeur d'Alene shops. So you see the waterfront, the lake came through, this gigantic boardwalk. And when it originally was built, none of this stuff was here. So it had this magnificent view of the water. And so the city came and did their thing. They had their dance events here, and it was an enormously popular thing. But obviously, when the 1900s came, they built a sawmill, they put in all these railheads, they had all these loading docks. Now, all of a sudden, this wasn't exactly a great place to have community events. And so, John Wood's forebear, Thompson, comes into the park. And this slow photograph here is just before the park was built. And you can see that Blackwell has built his railroad, he's got his buildings, you can see brand new power poles with lines come in, but you see the first version of dance pavilion that Thompson brought and installed in the park. The park isn't developed in any meaningful fashion. You can see, if you look into this photograph, you can see seedling ponderosa pines everywhere. And so, but this pavilion became kind of that community gathering place. And so what happens is that Blackwell, he makes his acquisition, but he also purchases Thompson's rights to the pavilion, because Thompson had some kind of lease and arrangement with the Federals to do this. And so Blackwell comes back and takes enlarges the pavilion. Essentially, that pavilion was about that big. He enlarges it and makes it much larger, puts in a formal bandstand, and then begins to landscape the park, which is, and so this becomes now not only a community gathering place, but a major destination for people to come kind of take a look and have fun at Coeur d'Alene. So this is a view of the park looking to the west. The rail lines are actually in the foreground, and you can see people are walking into the park. There's the bathhouse in the background. He had a major show fountain. And look at the people. The women are in long dresses. The men are in more formal attire. We have floral displays. And this place really becomes our community gathering area. And this, of course, was the baseball grandstand. You can see the battery building in the background, so you kind of get an idea of where this grandstand sat. Obviously, this upland area in the back is where these floral display and seating areas were. And then this baseball game happened. You can see the grandstand here, and the baseball field faced to, the southwest. And then this is a picture roughly at the corner of Lakeshore Drive and Park, looking back to the northeast. So baseball was a big thing, and so there was a lot of things that happened in this initial park that was developed, and so the more you look at the photographs, the more fun it is to see what they did. Here's Blackwell's show fountain. Here's the major pavilion in the background, and then we have all these other detailed photographs. This was the place to come have your picture taken. If you had family or you had your sweetie and you wanted to go have a memory made, you sat on the fountain and had your picture taken. And of course, we had these magnificent areas and if you look at the level of detail here, look at the sod, how it's been cut at a vertical edge, and these gravel pathways and the benches and and the floral displays. These black and white photographs are the basis of the postcards that we have. And so there were corporate picnics in the park. This is in the very heart of the park. The bandstand had about 2 or 3 different versions. This is a later version of it. So there was music, there was something always going on in the park. And then, of course, in the northern reaches, the tourist camp, as the automobile advanced and became our primary means of travel, this is the early version of the RV. We showed up and we wanted to go to the lake, or we were headed somewhere else and wanted to stop in Coeur d'Alene for the night. We stayed at the tourist camp. So what resulted was this fabulous waterfront where rail and boat and pedestrians kind of all merged. You can see the Idaho Hotel in the background here. This is the Idaho as it docked right at the depot grounds. This is looking to northeast. This view is looking southeast. This view is kind of hiding behind the depot. The depot was built by Blackwell. It was designed by a very famous architect out of Spokane by the name of Hislop, and W.W. Hislop, and who's designed a lot of classic homes in the Corbin Park area. But you can see the rail lines come through, the picket fences, the pathways, and this is that oval form we have seen in the previous photographs with the benches and the floral displays. And so, a view and a setting out of time. So the neat thing is we now have this park, we have our city, we're growing, and what happens? And so, we take you down through time with the book, but, some of the most compelling images we have of the park and of the city come from postcards. And so this chapter talks about the advent of postcards, talks about marketing, talks about, this is our version of the email pop-up, where in those days, people did some things that were actually pretty amazing. They actually wrote notes to each other instead of now sent emails or the things that we engage in to communicate. And so this chapter really just talks about how the black and white photographs were converted, but there's just some some great messages that you can find. I'll go back here. Uh, what you find on some of these cards are some amazing, notes. And on this particular one, this gal's writing a friend, and she says, "This is surely a lively town, 1912." But the fun is not only seeing these, how they were rendered in the lithographic, process, but also the notes that people write to each other. And this says the best place whatever happened. Big doings, dance every Wednesday and Saturday night. So you get an idea of the things that went on and how people, related to them and the fun they had. And of course, this is, this portion of this is the cover of my book, but this is, a twofold card of the park. It was taken on the 4th of July, 1906. And this is the view looking roughly north, slightly northwest. You can see the grandstands. It's facing to the southeast. You can see people, southwest. People are playing, there to watch a baseball game, but you can also see the other things that were going on. Must have been a hot day because everybody's kind of hanging in the shade, and so you begin to notice those things. And they tell a lot about, what went on at the park. And so these are the various views. These are all made from black and white images. Obviously, you recognize this image in the upper left, which was the original black and white photograph, and then various versions as we go down through time. These are early. These are in the 1910, 8, 9, 10, 12 era. These are a little later, probably in the late teens and 20s. So all kinds of images about the park, some colored accurately, some colored probably not so accurately, but you still, we didn't have color photography in those days. And this is how we marketed, and this is how we told about who we are, where we lived. So anyways, the idea of Blackwell Park, actually, I believe Blackwell Park was kind of the genesis of certain types of activities, because it's about that same time the park is done that the city of Spokane begins this really intensive park planning effort. They decide to go in and remodel this place called Montrose Park on the South Hill. They rename Montrose Park Manitou Park, and they put in a zoo, they put in a dance pavilion, they put in a whole host of things because during the real busy times, 4th of July, Memorial Day, Labor Day weekend, those kinds of 7,000 to 10,000 people a day are riding the train to come to Coeur d'Alene and have fun. And so, but they also had their growth issues that they were trying to mitigate and provide some positive things for their people. So this chapter talks about just an offhand reference in the Electric Railway Journal about something called the Inland Empire Park System. And so it's about this time, and I'm trying to recall exactly, in the late, maybe 7, 8, 9, 1907, 8, 9, Blackwell decides to merge his railway with J.P. Graves' rail system in Spokane, and to create this larger rail concern. And then they form these separate development companies, one for Liberty Lake, one for Hayden Lake, and then Blackwell later in Spirit Lake. And they build these parks or these recreation sites. Liberty Lake Park was an amazing place. We all know about Bazanta Tavern, and I'll show you some of that stuff in a minute. And then eventually Blackwell, and I don't know why just yet, I haven't quite found the information, whether it's because Weyerhaeuser came to Coeur d'Alene and built the Rutledge Mill or what, but Blackwell kind of goes out to Spirit Lake and he builds a massive sawmill out there, punches a railroad in there, and he builds a city, and then he builds 2 parks out there. And so this chapter just talks about the Inland Empire Rail Park System in a very brief sort of way, and talks about how Graves and Blackwell marketed the Inland Northwest to increase ridership, but also to, attract more people to come to the region. And this, obviously, this picture in the upper left hand is of the the park site at Spirit Lake. This picture in the lower left is of Liberty Lake Park, which turns out was a pretty amazing place. And then, of course, this is the historic Olmsted drawing. The Olmsteds did the planning for Bazanta Tavern with golf course. And of course, the electric line would come in, would unload and turn around and make its way back down to Coeur d'Alene. So they exported the park and built this larger regional outlook, which was pretty amazing to consider. So now the later chapters of the book kind of refer to, kind of take you down through time. Chapter 8 talks about the City Beautiful movement and how people were really trying to leverage what had been done at the park and do some additional things. City Beautiful movement led to a committee that raised money. They built the entry arches to the park. They did some other things. And, you know, this was taken up by Jon Mueller, who was the mayor at that time. And there are all kinds of stories about fundraising that they were trying to do. In the press, there's a great article, a great short article about how they set up as a fundraising thing a midway of carnival events that started at the corner of West Lakeshore and Park and went all the way along the waterfront down to what is now NIC. And so it was this gigantic circus carnival that they had. All the proceeds went to fund, you know, the arches in the city and some other various City Beautiful projects. And so, but what's most interesting is this you go into the Olmsted documents in the Library of Congress and National Archives. There's actually correspondence between John Charles and a local woman about trying to come in and do a city plan for the city of Coeur d'Alene, and how that effort, they just couldn't raise enough money to get that done. And but they did raise the money to build the arches, to create the arched entries into the park. And then you know, the final chapters are really of the book. We take you down through the years, and we talk about all the things that happened after World War I. You know, Woodrow Wilson was traveling around the country trying to sell the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. William Borah was just adamantly opposed. Wilson is making a northern swing through the United States, and guess what? He comes to Blackwell Park, and they set up a circus tent in what is now Memorial Field, and Wilson makes an address in 1919 and speaks to the governor and about 1,000 people in this circus tent, roughly where the grandstand is today. And it was shortly thereafter he leaves, he goes to Seattle. He swings about a week later, maybe 10 days later, he swings down through California and into Arizona, and he has a stroke. And so, you know, one of the last viable moments he had as a president was in Coeur d'Alene. And so in this chapter, we just show how the park kind of evolved. We see now, you know, the Gibbs Highway emerges from this, you know, this connection on the old Mullen Wagon Road to downtown. Now we see kind of the highway getting punched through. It eventually becomes Northwest Boulevard. Our city grows and changes. You know, the tourist camp, Big Chief Campground, all those things, all these different uses, commercial uses along Northwest Boulevard emerge. This is still federal ground, but it's all leased to these business concerns. And so, but we take you through time and we show you the pictures. This is, you know, the waterfront. This picture is taken, this is probably, I want to say somewhere around 1938, 39 maybe. And the reason I know that is because the auditorium is done. They've come in and they've built this auditorium as a Depression Works project, but we don't see the seawall. That wasn't put in, and that was built in, started in late 39 and into 40 and completed in 1940. So the waterfront is still kind of rugged and raw, but you know, for people like me, one of the memories I have is this landscape setting of these, the way these locust trees were shaped along the waterfront. But again, just we take you through in this chapter and take you down through time. You know, when the auditorium burns, they come back and they pour a concrete slab for outdoor dances. Um, the second generation grandstand and Memorial Park gets rebuilt in 1946 and into 47. And we just talk about the park as a resource, how it's evolved, how it's changed. The original bathhouse becomes now a band shell with bathrooms. But essentially, the focus is still there on the waterfront. And then, of course, the final chapter talks about legacy and some things to think about as we continue to grow as a city. And I won't dwell too much on those, other than to talk about, you know, initially, I think I talk about all the things there were decisions along the way, you know, that helped shape and get us where we are today. Sherman's decision to locate the fort, congressional action, you know, all kinds of options. At one point, they were talking about making the fort a retired soldier's home. You know, if they'd made that decision, we'd have a completely different outcome. But essentially, just talking about, you know, what we have today. And here's, of course, is Sean Gus' really terrific fall photograph of the lake from the air that I doctored a little bit to show you the landscape setting at the beginning of the presentation. But this is our city, and this is our waterfront, and this is, you know, and it's even changed since these photographs were taken, because we've completely changed all of this corridor. We've changed all of this for the college. And so we continue to grow and evolve as a city, and our city park has been part of that. So, you know, one of Blackwell's grandsons read the book and was really pleased with it, and was genuinely excited to see it come forward. We've had a lot of folks be very complimentary to the book and the process. And so, you know, it's one of those things where you finish a book and then you find all this other stuff that you wish you'd had into it, you know. I mean, pictures have come forward, additional things, stories. I think our friend Stephen, I think, had some talking about prize fights, confirming actual dates of football games, which we've known were played in the, you know, in the park. And stories, just like the Woodrow Wilson story. When you come across that, you're dumbfounded. You know, President of the United States, when we had three of them actually visit the area and come in, Taft and Roosevelt, I think when he came through but didn't stop, he didn't have a formal visit, you know, but again, you know, these things are important for us to make note of and to remember. But they also kind of build on the legacy of what this place was and how it's evolved. And so, you know, with that, the interpretive part of this, you know, is always such a large thing in my mind, about the stories we tell about First Peoples, about, you know, the initial arrival of the railroads. I'd love to be able to have a larger interpretive program, a walking tour put in, you know, to tell the story, not just about the park, but about the larger things. You go to other cities, this is in Washington, D.C., and they have these self-guided tours. And so to me, I would love to be able to kind of put something like that together to tell the story of the park, but also the growth and evolution of the city. So with that, Jocelyn, I'll kind of turn things back over to you if you have questions, but that's kind of an overview of the book. It's a lot of words coming from me, but it's the story that I tried to tell, and it's a lot to get out in a very short period of time. So with that.
And you did so incredibly well. I want to, let's see, pop over to my screen real quick and show your book. I mean, you've got your cover here, but I want to show everyone how they can get a copy of your book.
Yeah, please do so.
Is it showing? There we go. All right, so this is our newly designed website, and we've got your book and an excerpt, a little information on you and some reviews. And then people can share. So you can add it to your shopping bag, but also you can pin it, you can tweet it. How many photographs do you know roughly, are in your
Uh,
book?
I think it's well over 200.
Oh, wow.
Some are contemporary, but others, most are historic photographs from a whole host of sources. Jocelyn, it's a funny thing when you begin to kind of do something like this. You know, a lot of them I got from the museum. That's
Mhm.
sort of why we're partnering with them on the sale of the book for a number of the books to. Um, but you know, when you end up in the archives of the University of South Carolina for a photographer by the name of Davidson. And Davidson was a guy who went everywhere in the West. And I don't know if you recall those very famous pictures of the Wounded Knee Massacre photographs, you know, in the snow. And I won't dwell on those too much. He was the photographer, was there for and took those photographs. And he took some of the earliest photographs of Coeur d'Alene and the Coeur d'Alene area. And um, and so when you stumble into a site like that, and you see that, you know, how that was recorded and saved, and in that location, it's really an amazing thing. And so there's a whole host of sources that I've been fortunate to be able to get to, some private collections, obviously other folks. The Schneidmiller family gave me copies of some of those pictures of the Liberty Lake Pavilion and other waterfront stuff. And so bits and pieces, you put this stuff together. Sometimes, you know, on Facebook, people will post just odd assortment of photographs. This is my uncle, and he was in Blackwell Park, and he was, you know, my great uncle, and he was, you know, laying in the flowers, enjoying the day, you know. And so you save those and you catalog those because, to me, it's a great story to be able to continue to tell. You know, we sometimes get criticized because we have parks. We sometimes get criticized because they cost money to take care of. But if you look at the care and the interest and the use going all the way back 120 years, you know, certainly they've shaped our city and made us, you know, who we are today. Um, and so sourcing of this has been actually just a real um, joy, but also surprise. You know, what's next? You know, what's the new surprise? You know, coming across that quote from Sherman, you know, I'd rather have two tents on the banks of Coeur d'Alene. You know, those kinds of things, they all build together. And, you know, the picture from the elder family of Woodrow Wilson riding in a car on Sherman Avenue, you know, I mean, that's those, and he ends up in a circus tent at what is now Memorial Field in 1919. Those things are pretty amazing stories to be able to kind of tell and have pictures of. So,
So I wanted to read a quote. Actually, you talk about Facebook and photographs. We posted a photograph of the Gateway this last Sunday, and there was a comment, and I wanted to see if this is something that came up in your research. That uh, I've heard stories that local Native American children helped gather the rocks for the original structure, and that the soldiers rewarded them with Twizzlers licorice.
you know, I have not seen or heard that. That is, I wouldn't be surprised if that were true. I do know that the the money was raised by the City Beautiful Committee to build the gateways. The gateways were designed by George Williams, the architect, Williams and Williams, and the initial two, I think, were built. The first one was built obviously in the southeast corner. The second one was built and still exists today there on the west side of or at Park Drive. And then there was a third one that existed at the north west corner of the park. But as I'm given to understand, again, just anecdotally, I've looked for some sourcing on that. Uh, but Burl Hagedorn, I guess, was moving a home, and they had to make the turn on that corner, and the arch was in the way. And so the arch was torn down, but never replaced. And so that third arch came at a later time, but was, as I said, never replaced. Might be a good project maybe to take up. Now, to me, if the kids did gather the stones, young children, that would be a story, to in the building of a third arch would be fun to kind of bring the tribe together and do kind of a larger project of significance in terms of its dialogue and discussion.
So I had to ask because
No,
that was a story I'd not heard before either.
yeah, I mean, it's amazing. The oral history part of it, obviously, a lot of what they call anecdotal, sourcing, but friends I went to high school with. My grandfather told me the best story about a football game they played at Memorial. My grandfather told me they did this or they did that. I was having a conversation with Dick Barkley about a month and a half ago, before we got into all this virus stuff, and he was, former president of Rotary, and before the fire of the old ART, they had their history in their minutes, and the Rotary actually engaged with the Memorial Field Athletic Association to do those initial field improvements north of the Mullen Wagon Road, and that was in the early 1920s. And I was flabbergasted by that, and so you just come across people, and it tells you that we've got to do maybe more oral history, more scanning, more searching of people to what they know. Those things are kind of fun to find out and know. But again, it was just a random conversation I was having with Dick about Rotary's 100th anniversary in Coeur d'Alene, and they were looking for certain types of projects to do, and that just came out as part of the discussion, and it confirmed the time frame, because you go back and look, and the exact where, why, and how that isn't quite clear, but they made that move. They were wanting to do something to remember the World War I dead, and that's the project that initially emerged, and as I said, was remodeled again in 1946-47, and then now is finishing up, a third generation version of that first grandstand and field situation. So again, just after the fact, always amazing, more to learn, more to tell.
Isn't that the truth? And,
Yeah.
and like you said, even when you finish your book, that you always learn more things. That's why there's second and third editions.
They did, but yeah, we kind of figured.
So anyways, what else can I answer for you?
That was the only one that I saw. You really covered a lot of the notes that I have here. Going over the postcards, setting up the park system, and then the multiple uses of the space over a span of 100 years. So it was very thorough. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. I'm, happy to have been asked and to participate. And certainly I hope, as I understand it, you've recorded this, so maybe this is a chance for others to kind of learn if they want to take the time to do so. But do appreciate it, and certainly a labor of love. I'm continuing to find photographs and save them. I think at some point there may be another edition, but because the park again has changed, all those extensive improvements at Memorial and North, and so as I say in the book, we've tended to break the park apart over time. There's Independence Point, there's City Beach, there's City Park, there's Memorial Field, but I tend to look at the whole thing in its entirety is what, because we were given 20 acres, we had a chance probably to have another 20 acres. We decided not to do that, but we did get probably another 8 or 9 of that 20 acres to add to it, which is, of course, on the west side of Northwest Boulevard, where the museum parking lot is, where the museum building is today, and just north of that. But to me, I look at it as a larger whole. This was this fabulous place to gather. The train came to the waterfront. You got on a boat, or if your boat wasn't ready to leave, you hung out in downtown, or you hung out in the park, or if you got back from a lake trip and your train wasn't ready to leave for Spokane, you might walk up and have a meal, come back down to the park, and then get on the train and go home. And so it was just this fabulous place that was very, for the time, very elegant. It was the time, that before motor vehicles destroyed our cities, and actually bankrupted the railroads, or put them in extreme financial duress. And so you look at the pictures that we have, and it was a pretty amazing place. And so fun to know.
Does take
Fun to know, and fun to be able to tell. So.
Well, and it's my favorite park too, mostly because of the canopy. I really appreciate the shade that City Park has that McEwen Park just does not have.
Well, one of the things we did at the end of the book is there's an appendix where we've identified every tree that's in the park.
Oh, nice.
And there are some amazing trees. There are 3 American chestnut trees, which are extremely rare. They're the roasting chestnut type of chestnut, not like the horse chestnut we have. At some point in the 20th century, I want to say in the late 20s, early 30s, there was a blight that came across the United States and killed all the American chestnuts. And so if you walk down into City Park, and they're in a cluster, there's 3 of them. These trees were planted as part of the original park effort. They're huge, beautiful, beautiful trees, and extremely rare, but also, kind of that gift from that era. So, and we have that list of all the trees, and kind of went through and did an inventory. So if you're interested in that canopy, like you are, that will tell you what's growing in the park.
Oh, that's great. So everyone go to museumni.org and get your copy, because we got Mother's Day, we got Father's Day. These are great gifts.
So with that, Jocelyn, I think I'm going to sign out, if that's okay.
That is okay. Thank you so much for letting me, well, I didn't really interview you. You had it all under control, just like a good professor that you are.
Well, I didn't know exactly what format you wanted to use, but I have made this presentation before. And so, Stephen, thanks to you for joining the fun, and I will catch up to both of you at some point.
Okay, thanks.
Okay,
It was good to see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you later.